Okay, right. Welcome everybody to the Marks Moore Library and to our meeting online on behalf of the Marks Moore Library. I'm Marianne Jump. I'm the archivist and library manager here at the MML. For those of you who don't know much about us, I'll just say a few words. We're a very unusual organisation. We were founded in 1933, so next year's our 90th anniversary, as both a library of socialist and Marxist literature and archives, but also a workers' school. So we've always put on classes, lectures, we have correspondence courses, reading groups, all sorts over the past decades. Welcome you all to the first in this our summer lecture series on trade unions and the Labour Party, looking at the influence of economism, imperialism and syndicalism. This is our first ever also hybrid meeting, so we have people joining us both online and here at the MML, so we're delighted, but do be patient with the technology. It will be seamless. We're recording this, so we're going to be putting this up on our website in the next few days. And we'll be recording the Q&A as well, just unless people say they don't want to be, we can cut people out, but you let us know if there's any issues with that. We're joined by Alex Gordon, our chair on site next to me here, and Professor Mary Davis from home. The plan is we'll be hearing from both of them in kind of conversation, this virtual space, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And so we should be able to bring people in both on site and online. We'll work that out at the end, but it will be seamless. We'll be able to raise hands both in real life and virtually. I think that's definitely enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Alex to introduce the.
Okay. Well, thanks, Marion, and welcome everyone. And just first of all to say about this course, this is a series of 3 lectures, which we're attempting to deliver using hybrid technology, and we'll see how that goes. But the lectures obviously are, as advertised, around the theme of trade unions and the Labour Party, and in particular the questions of economism, syndicalism and imperialism, 3 big concepts, and which not everyone is familiar with, and how those influence politics today in our unions. So I think it's worth saying that we're sitting here in the main hall of the Marks Memorial Library, and looking down on us is a portrait of Comrade Tom Mann, who was the first chair of the library when it was founded in 1933. And Mann is, for those who don't know and for those who do as well, is really one of the grand old men of syndicalism in Britain, who became a Marxist-Leninist, joined the Communist Party, was a sort of key leading member of the party in the 1920s and early 30s in its early period. So he's a very interesting example of somebody who makes that transition from syndicalism into Marxism. And that is something, he wasn't the only one to do that. There's a theme there which people have written about. In fact, I've got a book here by Ralph Darlington on that very subject. But the series that we're running here is, I suppose, the inspiration for it is what's happening currently in British politics and in the British trade union movement, where we can see that we have currently, since the beginning of this year, an upsurge in class struggle, an increase in strikes, but also we can see that there's an increasing divorce between a lot of the action that workers and trade unions are taking and the politics of the Labour Party. And that's also, I don't think I need to go into substantiating that. That's fairly clear from anyone who reads the news or watches Starmer telling his front bench not to go on picket lines. So there's a strike wave going on at the moment. It's fairly small at the moment, but it's got indications that it's growing, and there are some very big unions that are currently balloting their members for strike action later this summer. So we'll see how that goes, and who knows what will happen given the current state of the Labour Party. So within that context, the aims of this series are that we want to look at the origins of the trade unions and capitalism in Britain, the historic role of trade unions in the fight against exploitation. We want to answer the question, or at least ask the question and attempt to answer, what is economism? This evening's the first of 3 lectures, where we're going to be analysing economism as the historic and current relationship between British trade unions and the Labour Party. And to do, we'll be examining the development of this uniquely Labourist form of British social democracy, which is distinct from the forms in which social democracy emerged in continental Europe, and is specific to the development of British capitalism. And my comrade and colleague, Mary Davis, Professor Mary Davis, is going to lead us through that. So we'll be looking at the British trade unions from 1850 to 1890 as an example of what one might call right-wing economism. And then we'll be looking at the British trade unions through the period from approximately 1906 with the Trade Union Act through to 1926 with the general strike, which was characterised by increasing and substantially high levels of class struggle. The syndicalist period, as it's been called by some historians, and we would call that left-wing economism. And we're going to look at some of the contrasts between those two periods to try and understand what economism is and its relationship to the British labour movement and the trade unions. So having sort of introduced that, I'm going to hand over to Professor Mary Davis and ask her to start taking us through some of those questions, and I'll sort of chip in from time to time. So over to you, Mary.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm sorry, I'm not, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry I can't be with you. I'm just recovering from COVID, but I do hope that I will be sitting next to Alex for the next 2 sessions, the next 2 Tuesdays. So today, today I want to cover these 3 points. First of all, what is this mysterious term economism? What Lenin says about it, the syndicalism of the left, syndicalism of the right, or economism of the left and economism of the right, I'm sorry, pardon me, and whether or not it's a useful concept, and how we apply this to looking at 2 major periods in British trade union history, 1850s to 1910 and 1910 to 1926. So that's what I'm hoping to cover. So first question is then, what is economism? Well, Lenin was the one that really utilized the term. I don't even know whether the word existed before, but I don't know what it is in Russian, but certainly economism is nothing to do totally with economics. What Lenin did was to identify 2 trends within the in the Russian labour movement at the time, but which are very, very pertinent, I think, to us. In the first case, he said that there was a form of right-wing economism. He was referring to the Narodniks, but never mind about that. The main thing is that the line was that their line was that capitalism has triumphed, and therefore there can be no question of a political revolution. The practical conclusion was that the economic struggle be left to the workers and the political struggle to be left to the liberals. That, he says, is a curvet to the right. And I think we can see how that might apply in general, not just to the Russian conditions in that period, 1894 to 92. But he also talked about left-wing economism as a curvet to the left. And that curve to the left was advocated in a particular pamphlet. But basically said that really the struggle for reforms and democracy is actually really not particularly important. The main thing is a general strike, and that will bring about the socialist revolution. So economism, therefore, is a useful term in identifying two trends, particularly within the trade union movement. Sorry. So just looking at this, whether or not this is particularly useful in understanding the British labour movement and its history. Well, as I said, I think it does help in analysing what we can see, or what we're arguing is the two dominant trends in our trade union movement, probably elsewhere as well. But it would be quite wrong to suggest that economism is simply trade unionism, and therefore that somehow or other this is wrong, that it's wrong to fight for immediate economic or political issues. In fact, Lenin, in a very famous phrase in What Is to Be Done, argues that, that lending the economic struggle itself a political character means striving to secure the satisfaction of trade union demands, the improvement of working conditions in each separate trade by legislative and administrative means. This is precisely what trade unions do and have always done. The phrase lending the economic struggle itself a political character means nothing more than the struggle for economic reforms. Now, he wasn't diminishing that. This was an argument that he was having with others who wanted to leave, who were saying, sort of from a leftist perspective, that somehow or other just waging the economic struggle will itself lead to political changes. And of course, he was saying that that's actually not correct. So within British trade unions after 1850, as I hope to show in a moment, there was a form of right-wing economism in the sense that there was a rejection of the capital versus labour model, and which basically meant an accommodation with capitalism. Now, that's not to say that the trade unions didn't struggle for reforms, they did, but is the struggle for reform reformist? Marxists have a very particular take on what reformism is. It means basically not making accommodation within the system and seeing the struggle for reforms as its end point, and that socialism is a remote goal. So struggling for reforms, though, is absolutely correct. But if we say that's an end in itself, then that is reformist and tends to the right. Sorry, but this is sort of post-COVID cough. So what is the role of trade unions, therefore?
Mary, do you want me to come in there?
Yes, do, please.
I was just going to, while you're recovering from your cough, just to comment on this question that was on the previous slide, if you could go back one slide, which is the question about political and economic demands, or political and economic reforms. So, I mean, this argument about the relationship between political and economic demands goes back a long way. It goes back to the foundation, at least to the foundation of the First International, and the arguments that were refuted by Marx in his lectures that were then published after his death as Wages, Price and Profit. So within the First International, within the General Committee, the argument was advanced by a venerable British chartist called Citizen Weston.
Sorry, carry on.
That because of the iron law of wages, or the wages fund theory as it was known, which was a fallacy derived from John Stuart Mill, but popularised by Robert Owen, that there was a fixed amount of money in circulation in wages in the economy. And if one worker was able to increase their share of wages by getting a wage rise, then another worker must lose out by getting a decrease in wages or becoming unemployed. Weston proposed a motion to the First International that because of this feature of wage rises being injurious to some workers, that the First International should not support strikes where workers took strike action in order to win wage rises. So the First International in 1864, having just been formed, was confronted with this proposal that they shouldn't support strikes for higher wages. And Marx refutes this argument, this fallacy, in a couple of lectures that he gave to the General Committee, where he points out the true relationship between wages and profits is a dynamic relationship based on class struggle, and that it's possible to increase wages by reducing the amount of surplus value that employers or capitalists are able to appropriate through profit. So reallocating profits into the wages column. That was the simple argument that was put. But argument isn't just a dry argument about, Weston's proposal, his original proposal was that instead of supporting wage demands, trade unions should fundamentally be about demanding political reform, as the Chartists had done. They should be pleading for expansions to the franchise, petitioning, asking for political reforms. So this is the kind of, if you like, this is reducing trade unions to a sort of caricature of a reformist political organisation. Marx was arguing in 1864 that trade unions had another role. They had a role of organising class struggle. They had a role of fighting over the allocation of surplus value derived from their labour. But of course, he finishes Wages, Price and Profit by saying that the workers should inscribe on their banner not the watchword, a fair day's work for a fair day's pay, but the abolition of the wages system, because fundamentally, the wage capitalism will always tend towards monopoly capitalism and impoverishment of the workers. So I think that argument about politics versus economics in the trade union movement has been around since at least 1864, and obviously a lot earlier than that as well. And that's I think the genesis of what we're talking about tonight.
Okay, so this brings us on to, interestingly enough, exactly what Marx said in Wages, Prices and Profit, and what he said about trade unions, because he saw, as did Lenin, and of course, as we do today, trade unions are absolutely vital. First of all, he was talking about taking up Alex's point, look, wage levels can only be settled by a continuous struggle between capital and labour. The capitalist constantly tending to reduce wages to their physical minimum and to extend the working day to its physical maximum, while working men, I mean, he means people, the German word Mensch really means people, constantly presses in the opposite direction. So this is in Wages, Price and Profit, where he takes issue with Citizen Weston, who basically argued that wage rises cause price rises, which is a very topical issue now. Do wage rises cause inflation? Of course they don't. And Lenin then developed, and by the way, this was extremely important in that time because Marx had a limited experience of the British, well, he had some experience of the British trade union even before 1850, but after 1850, as we shall see, it did veer in a very different direction. Lenin argued that, and again, this is a quote on strikes, that every strike brings thoughts of socialism very forcibly to the worker's mind, thoughts of the struggle of the entire working class for the emancipation from the oppression of capital. This is the reason that socialists call strikes a school of war, a school in which the workers learn to make war on their enemies for the liberation of the whole people. And I'm sure Alex would want to come in there. Alex, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that quote from Lenin is superb. It does encapsulate the confrontation that takes place in the minds of workers when they're forced into a position of taking strike action. And I think that you are seeing, to some extent, the demonstration of what Lenin's talking about in that quote now taking place in this country. I mean, we talk about the cost of living crisis. Some people think that's a slightly euphemistic, but we can certainly see that workers' wages in this country and in many other developed capitalist economies have been falling now for 30 or 40 years in real terms. And we're in a situation where working class people, even skilled working class people, are often in receipt of state benefits in various forms in order to survive. There's clearly more and more a systemic crisis of wage labour capitalism in Britain, and that systemic crisis exhibits itself increasingly in public ways through food banks, through homelessness, through poverty, and in the current phase of industrial action that we've seen in 2022, we are seeing these type of effects of capitalism being openly discussed. It's no longer something that's hidden and shameful. You go to trade union meetings now. I should say I'm a trade unionist, and you go to trade union meetings and people are talking to their colleagues, their fellow trade unionists, about real and absolute poverty, things like child poverty, how to feed children during school holidays, talking about the fear that people have about the increase in domestic energy bills that have taken place in April, the increases coming in October, the further increase that will be happening in January. They're talking about the increase in prices of food in the shops. So there's this real pervasive sense in which working people feel their existence is actually being threatened, and they are wondering how they're going to survive. And in that situation, the strike, the active collective action of withdrawing your labour becomes a school of war, in the sense that Lenin used that phrase in this quote here. It becomes a way in which people bring those fears together, get them out in the open, and decide that they're going to address those fears by demanding a bigger slice of the cake. And in terms of the context in which we're talking about now, in particular, trying to smash the government's 2% pay limit on pay increases. So I think this is a very prescient and useful quote from Lenin.
So I want to now just to look at how this applies to British trade union history, and to argue that what we see from the mid-19th century onwards is a form of what we call right-wing economism, in other words, reformism. Now, why do I say that from the mid-19th century? Basically because up until roughly 1850, trade unions were very, very different. Trade unions much more conformed to a very, very class struggle basis, in the sense that they did actually fulfill that kind of notion that Lenin was talking about many, many years later. This was the the period between roughly the end of the 18th century to the mid-19th century, when industrial capitalism was just about cementing itself properly in Britain as the first industrial nation. And prior to the fact that, and so it was characterized by peaks and troughs, by slumps and booms and all the rest of it. And in this period, general unions were formed, which had a very, very distinct political message. And that was, I think, probably best encapsulated by several movements at the beginning of the 19th century, and in particular Chartism, which was, in fact, by 1842, formally constituted as a political party and was actually the first working class political party to be formed anywhere in the world. It had membership cards and all the rest of it. And in 1842, there was a general strike, the first general strike ever. 1926 wasn't the first. Now, so what we're witnessing with the labour movement in its early stages was bordering on being revolutionary, but bordering on being revolutionary pre-Marx. And Marx and Engels noted this, and so did Marx. However, by the mid-19th century, things changed. British capitalism stabilized itself. It was the first industrial nation. No other country had mechanized and industrialized in the same way. And so it's sometimes referred to by roughly mid-19th century that Britain was the workshop of the world. British exports dominated world trade. And the British staple industries, notably coal, cotton, and engineering, were absolutely predominant in the world. And so Britain was a very rich country. Of course, it was developing its colonial empire, which is, I won't go into today, that will come in next week. Now, in those conditions, a new kind of form of labour movement, trade union movement developed. And that trade union movement was very much based upon what Lenin called the labour aristocracy. That labour aristocracy developed largely in this period because it was possible through the incredible profitability of capitalism to what Lenin termed bribe and bourgeoisify a section of the working class. That's probably putting it a bit too strongly, but the trade unions that were formed in that period reflected the split within the working class, i.e. sort of a much more stable and well-paid section, particularly skilled workers, you could say, who formed what were known as new model unions, modelled on the pattern of the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, formed in 1851. And their motto was defence, not defiance. They believed that they could, using the skill and scarcity value of their labour, work within the system in order to reap great benefits. These unions excluded unskilled, semi-skilled workers and utterly excluded women, completely and utterly excluded women. And it was from these new model unions that the TUC was eventually formed. And the TUC, when it was established in 1868, formed its parliamentary committee. So I can't wait. I'd like to say more about the labour aristocracy. I won't. Just want to concentrate on what form of politics this represented. George Howell was the secretary of the TUC parliamentary committee. And in 1875, he resigned his post as secretary of the parliamentary committee, which, by the way, the parliamentary committee was there to lobby for changes in the law relating to trade unions, and they were ultimately successful. Both the Tory and the Liberal governments of the day, notably under Disraeli and Gladstone, did implement trade union reforms, which gave basic rights to protection of trade union funds, peaceful picketing, and so on. A whole raft of legislation in the 1870s, which were thought by Howell and others in the TUC to have represented a tremendous boost. The parliamentary committee was therefore kind of a lobby group, but George Howell was so convinced that they'd achieved so much that in 1875 he resigned his post on the grounds that the work of emancipation was now full and complete. In other words, trade unions had a legal existence, and that was wonderful. And that then led to, not George Howell's resignation, it's just I think it's interesting that he thought that the work was done. But of course, in 1867, those workers, or what we might call the labour aristocracy, were enfranchised by the 1867 the Second Reform Act. So that section of workers now had the vote. And of course, that then meant that both Tory, Conservative and Liberal parties campaigned for the support of these of this newly enfranchised section of male workers, and that led to the Tories obviously campaigning for that sort of vote. If they hadn't, they'd never been in office again. But the Liberal Party was very active, and what they did then was to sponsor candidates from working class areas to enter Parliament. In fact, two miners were the first ones who did that, and hence the term Lib-Labism was coined, which basically meant trade unions, labourers standing under the ticket of the Liberal Party. And this phenomenon of Lib-Labism yielded its first results in the 1874 election with, as I said before, Thomas Burt became the Liberal MP, a miner from Morpeth, and Alexander MacDonald, who was the Secretary of the National Miners Association, was also returned as an MP for Stafford. So the TUC Parliamentary Committee itself did continue despite George Howell's resignation, but it advised tactical voting at election time by submitting a series of what they called test questions to the candidates, seeking their attitudes on current questions of concern to trade unionists. So thus it was that modern trade unionism had discovered that its economic and political interest could be accommodated within the framework of the existing system, and that this system was expansive and pragmatic enough to incorporate those interests. In this sense, the British labour movement was unique in Europe, and by the 1880s, a strong, although narrowly based trade union movement had been created, the very success of which in its interdependent harmony with the existing political system, banished all thoughts, let alone practical steps, of political independence. The surprise is, I suppose, that the situation remains so long after the material conditions to which it had given rise passed. However, by the 1880s, there were stirrings of a challenge. The boom was over, and the ensuing depression questioned this form of complacency. So, in other words, it lasted until the Lib-Labism lasted until, at long last, and it wasn't until 1900 that it was felt that actually Labour didn't, the Liberals weren't representing the Labour interest, and maybe Labour should have its own independent voice in Parliament. Not as yet a political party, and it took an awful long time for that to come about. What was formed in 1900 was a Labour Representation Committee, which was only called for the voice of Labour to be represented in Parliament as a lobby group. And actually, it lobbied and did deals mainly with the Liberal Party. It wasn't until 1918 that the Labour Party was fully formed with a constitution. So in other words, this, I think, represents a classic form of what might be called right-wing economism. Classically aligning itself to bourgeois political parties in the struggle for some reforms and forms of social change, and was actually successful in some respects. in some respects only. So,
can I just jump in there, Mary?
yeah.
I was just going to say there's a interesting sort of synchronicity about that period of right-wing economism, reformism that you're describing, that the second Great Reform Act of 1867, although it included some skilled workers, it excluded railway workers, and it was one of the it was one of the reasons that led to the formation of the first railway workers' unions, was the fact that they'd been spurned by the Liberals, by Disraeli in the second Great Reform Act, that they didn't enjoy being included in the franchise. So, I mean, there's one historian, David Howell, who refers to the early railway trade unionists as these respectable radicals. You know, there were these liveried company servants who were organising in trade unions in order to extend their, to bargain collectively and to extend their political rights. And it's not an accident that the 1900 Labour Representation Committee came about from a resolution from the Amalgamated Society of Railway Servants. So in 1899, the Doncaster branch of the ASRS passed a resolution moved by one Thomas Steeles that the trade union, the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, should found a party of Labour. That was the resolution that went to the 1899 TUC Congress conference in Plymouth, was carried by a fairly slim majority, but was carried. And from that was born the Labour Representation Committee. So there is this kind of interesting, certainly interesting from my perspective as an RMT trade union member, which is the sort of successor of this union of respectable radicals, that they were excluded in 1867. They set about their organisation of their all grades trade union. Their campaigning inevitably became highly politicised because the railway companies that they were confronted with were massively powerful in Parliament and in the House of Lords. And so it led them to the conclusion that they needed to sponsor the formation of a political party of the trade union movement, a political party of Labour. Anyway, over to you.
Well, that's absolutely right, and it's a very, very good point. So, what I want to look at now is the next period, which is 1910 to 1926, in which syndicalism was uppermost. And the reason that I referred in the last slide to the 1880s, and there was a bit of a change within the trade union movement then, because basically trade unions spread and recruited, and this time amongst semi-skilled and to some extent unskilled workers from the 1880s onwards. This is a period of sometimes called new unionism. And it was from not just because there was a Britain's position of the workshop of the world really was overtaken by the 1880s by the massive industrialization of other countries, particularly Germany and to some extent the United States of America. And that even led some of the older unions, the older new model unions, to become much more radical because the economy was no longer booming as it was. Imperialism saved the day for the British ruling class, but that's something again that we'll come on to next week. So in the I'll talk about the upsurge in a moment, but just first of all to define what syndicalism is. Now, this is more of a sort of truncated quote from the 1906 Charter of Amiens, the Charte d'Amiens. which basically was the foundation of the French CGT, the Confédération Générale du Travail. And the CGT became the premier revolutionary union in the world with over 100,000 members. Now, I'm quoting it because this was very influential, these precepts, if you like, on all syndicalist movements, which developed particularly in the early years of the 20th century. So basically, syndicalism said that syndicalism seeks the coordination of workers' efforts. In other words, a sort of an amalgamation of workers' well-being by the achievement of immediate improvements, reduction in wages, hours, etc. It prepares so that should be a kind of a unified struggle. That's the day-to-day demands, but it also prepares for complete emancipation, which can only be realized by expropriating the capitalist class. And how is that done? By the form of the general strike as its means of action, and that the trade unions today, an organization of resistance, will be in the future the organization of production and distribution, the basis of social organization. So this double task, the day-to-day and the future task, derives from the position of wage earners, which weighs upon the working class and which charges all workers, whatever their political, philosophical opinions and inclinations, with the duty to belong to an essential organisation, the trade union. In other words, the political process or political parties were really to be jettisoned. It was through this struggle, the day-to-day struggle and the long-term struggle for complete emancipation, which can only be won through means of a general strike. Now, there's various forms of syndicalism, but those 4 points are at root in all of them. This sometimes is called anarcho-syndicalism, but as we shall see, it had a bearing on the British development of trade unions. In America, the syndicalist movement developed in slightly different ways, but I think these points are basically yes, general to more or less all formations. And then I want just to look at how this manifested itself in Britain.
Just come in on the CGT a moment, Mary.
Yes, go on, please do.
So the CGT is originally formed, I think, in 1895, but the Chartre d'Amiens becomes the real clarification point of its relationship with politics. So preceding the Chartre d'Amiens, there'd been a split within the CGT, effectively with a group who was sort of known as the Guedists, followers of Jules Gued, who was a proponent of the idea of a socialist political party. And there was a historic split between the CGT and the proponents of French socialism in the form of political party socialism. And they walked out, they were more or less expelled from the CGT. And so you have this very, very demarcated separation within that CGT tradition in France, which even to some extent they hold on to today in French trade unionism and in the CGT, which is that there is a complete separation, at least on paper, between the trade union and the political party. Now, that was obviously something of that was not the case, certainly after the formation of the French Communist Party in 1920. But the split between the political wing of the labour movement and the economic wing, or the trade union wing of the labour movement in France, is like crystallised in this very, very clear organisational break, which in a way exemplifies this argument about left economism. It's an example of left economism, the French experience. Back to you, Mary.
Right. So let's have a look at how this manifests itself in Britain. And the context of this, of syndicalism in Britain, is the period 1910 to 14. the period known sometimes as the Great Unrest. From 1910 until the outbreak of World War I, the number of working days lost in strikes rose to an annual total of more than 10 million or more. Now, you can see here these figures. 1908 averaged 30 disputes a month, 1911, 75 disputes a month, 1913 to 14, 150 disputes a month. And I mean, these were real disputes. This one here is actually the Liverpool, massive strike in Liverpool. That man in the middle is Tom Mann, actually, addressing a massive crowd on George's Plateau, which the police attacked with absolute brutality. So trade union membership itself rose, and this is the period where trade unions were developing amongst semi-skilled and to some extent unskilled workers. Trade union membership rose from 2.5 million workers in 1910 to 4 million in 1914. And in the same period, TUC affiliations rose from 1.5 million to nearly 2.25 million. There were major unions like the Miners' Federation of Britain, the dockers and the railway workers all staged strike action in this period. And most of these strikes were defeated by brutal government forces, but this didn't deter trade union organisation and militancy. And if we take, for example, the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, which later became the National Union of Mine Workers, its membership was over 900. Well, it leapt from 160,000 to over 900,000 at this time. It was the biggest and potentially the most powerful union in the world, actually. It was very big, and the centre for most of the struggles that occurred in this period right up until 1926 centred around the miners and actually the engineers, the three staple industries, coal, cotton and engineering, where British capital had not invested in those industries. It had rather preferred to invest its capital abroad, where the rate of return in its colonies were much, much higher. And that meant that the only way that these former staple industries, the industries on which Britain's economic industrial wealth had been based, were starved of investment. The only way they could make profit was either by lengthening the working day or by cutting pay. And those three industries were major sources of discontent, rebellion, and so on. So that's that period of the Great Unrest. It was quite a remarkable period, actually. In fact, there were three major movements coalescing in this period. There was the struggle for women's emancipation, for suffrage. There was the struggle to liberate Ireland from British colonial rule, and then there was the mass struggle of workers against rapacious capitalism. And very fortunately for the British ruling class, in 1914, World War I occurred, which in a sense, helped to stem the tide, but it didn't. And I just want to then look at the manifestations of syndicalism within this period of the Great Unrest, but actually it went beyond that. There were syndicalism in Britain showed absolute disdain for the antics of the Labour group in the House of Commons. You remember mentioning the Labour Representation Committee. They said it just had become a mere adjunct of the Liberal Party. And the syndicalists were absolutely disgusted with lib-labism, and they viewed it as embodying the worst kind of reformism. This then led syndicalists themselves to a rejection of party politics and a concentration on industrial unionism and rank and file movements, a distrust of leaders who they thought had become incorporated within the system, including the miners' leaders and everyone else. So a key plank of syndicalism was the rejection of the official leadership. And this was most ably articulated in this pamphlet, The Miner's Next Step, which was the platform of the unofficial Reform Committee in the South Wales Miners Federation. This platform of the work, The Miner's Next Step, was originally drafted by a miner called Noah Ablett, who was from Mardi, and it was born out of the bitter struggle of the miners, particularly in 1910 to 11. Basically, this mistrust of leadership was expressed in this following quote: "Without power, the leader is inept. The possession of power inevitably leads to corruption. All leaders become corrupt in spite of their own good intention. No man was ever good enough, brave enough, or strong enough to have such power at his disposal as real leadership implies." So very much based on rank and fileism. They were disgusted with the leadership of the Miners' Federation itself. But the best and most, I suppose in a sense, this was the best and most popular expression of the syndicalist tradition. Its opposition to the encrusted collaborationist miners' union leadership was matched only by its class hatred of the coal owners. It advocated, this is the Miners' Next Step, a repudiation of the existing system of conciliation and collective bargaining in favour of rank and file control of the union and workers' control of industry. To this end, it proclaimed the syndicalist tenet, which was very important for them: an industrial vote will affect the lives and happiness of workmen far more than a political vote. Hence, it should be more sought after and its privileges more jealously guarded. So the syndicalism did provide a revolutionary focal point for the struggle of rank and file militants, especially in the rail, mining and engineering unions, and to some extent the cotton industry as well. And Tom Mann, who Alex referred to earlier, founded the Industrial Syndicalist Education League, and they have published their own paper called The Syndicalist. But in a sense, it was a bit of a far cry from the syndicalism on the continent elsewhere, and including America. Basically, what they were advocating was a form of industrial unionism. And this, again, in the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, which was one of the new model unions, was very, very active in this. In fact, Tom Mann himself just lost the secretaryship of that union by a few votes, really. So amongst the miners, the Unofficial Reform Committee and the engineers, all of them established these reform committees, and they helped to forge a number of amalgamations in the trade union field, especially sort of industrial unionism, on the railways and transport. And they played a crucial role in the shop stewards movement in the First World War. So, but the fact is that for all its incredible spread of trade unionism, and the fact that Tom Mann and the industrial did not advocate what they did on the continent of establishing dual unions. They wanted to work within the existing system to establish amalgamations and industrial unionism. However, this notion of the strike, which would therefore lead to the establishment of workers' control of capitalism, presumably, of the means of production anyway, very much left women on the sidelines, because in essence it was really only the big firms or the big combines that were subject to the interest of syndicalism. Most women worked either in tiny little workshops or domestic work and small, jam and pickle factories. These weren't the big guns. It was the big guns of coal, cotton, engineering and transport that were the ones. And to some extent, during the First World War, this movement continued. It inspired the shop stewards movement, which despite the Munitions of War Act and the Defence of the Realm Act, which forbade strikes, it nevertheless, strikes did take place, and especially because it actually, the war itself seemed to prove the point that was made in the Miners' Next Step, that all leaders are corrupt. Basically, Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister at the time, managed to incorporate all the existing union leaders of every single union into agreeing that there should be no strikes in their industries, which is why the shop steward movement became so important. There were no full-time officials in trade unions who would back strikes, but the people that the workers elected at their point of production did support strike action. There was massive strike action, despite the fact that all strikes were illegal. And moves towards amalgamation proceeded apace during World War I with the formation of the Triple Alliance, which was the alliance between the rail unions and all the transport, rail and mining industries. And interestingly enough, there was a big push not in a revolutionary sense, but actually it was to some extent inspired by syndicalism, of the movement for one big union. And the union which exemplified that and actually managed to succeed in forming one big union was the union that was eventually formed in 1922, the Transport and General Workers Union, which was, people like Ernest Bevan were at the forefront in doing that. So there were peculiarities of British syndicalism. It's almost a special case, really, because it worked within the existing system. And the influence, really, of the First World War and the Russian Revolution, in a sense, as a point that I think that Alex had mentioned earlier, it led people like Tom Mann away from that and into politics. When there was a massive demonstration in Glasgow in 1918, massive demonstration, massive strike action called by the Clyde Workers' Committee. Willie Gallagher, who's one of the leaders, said then, we were conducting a strike when we should have been conducting a revolution. Such was the strength of the movement. So when, in fact, the Communist Party was formed in 1920, it was these shop stewards that played a crucial role in its formation, including of the miners from the Unofficial Reform Committee. Life itself taught them, and particularly the lessons of the Russian Revolution, that politics could not be ignored. The question was, what sort of politics? Was it going to be revolutionary politics, or was it going to be reformist politics? And the answer, of course, was provided in 1920 when the Communist Party was formed. But the crucial aspect of that is that within that did not stop the fight within trade unions for a more left-wing movement, which we won't go into today. But the formation, for example, of a minority movement during the 1920s, which led in an important respect to the 1926, the general strike. You can see that there is an influence of left syndicalism plus, but a syndicalism which in a way had jettisoned the rejection of politics. 1926 almost marks a turning point, which I won't go into today because we haven't got time. So syndicalism in Britain is a slightly special case, but it was very influential, I would say, up until 1926. But it changed its form and its content.
I'm just gonna jump in, Mary.
I've stopped. I'm going to stop screen sharing, and I've stopped. I've finished.
Okay, I mean, just to say on syndicalism that it was an immensely powerful movement at mobilising millions of workers. I mean, I think there were 40 million days lost to strike action in 1912 when the miners and the dockers came out. It was an immensely powerful force. There were, however, significant problems with syndicalism was the question of ownership of industry. So the syndicalist argued the mines for the miners, the railways for the railwaymen. Well, railways weren't built for railwaymen. Railways were built in order to, as the sinews of an industrial society. It makes no sense to talk about the railways for the railwaymen in that sense. They're only useful as a social good and a social, under social ownership. And the problem that, sorry about this, I've tested negative. The problem that they found really was expressing the form that that social ownership could take, because, of course, the syndicalists eschewed the role of the state. They were anti-statist. And so if you eschew the role of the state, then you have to come up with some other political formation, essentially, that is capable of organising society at a sort of superstructural level. Because they rejected nationalisation to some extent, miners' next step does pay lip service to nationalisation. They had this real problem. I think also syndicalism is largely silent on the question of imperialism. The syndicalists organised across what was then the British Empire and the Anglo-Saxon world. So they organised Australia, South Africa, North America, Canada, as well as, of course, in French, Italian, and Spanish, and the Spanish world as well. But in, I think, none of those cases did any of the syndicalist unions confront the question of the imperialism of their own ruling class. They more or less followed the trade routes and the industrial routes set out by their own the capitalism of their own ruling class, and sort of organise workers, and predominantly white workers, although that's not completely true. In South Africa, syndicalism was very influential on the earliest black African trade unions. And I think finally, the problem that syndicalism had at its root was it had nothing to say about capital. So what did the syndicalists want to do with the banks? I mean, they wanted to turn them into buildings that could be used by the workers, but what did they want to do with capital, with money, with credit, with all that dead labour that capital comprises? And they had no really articulate argument about how to collectivise banks and use credit and capital as a social good, which was the argument that was being put forward, of course, by Lenin and the Bolsheviks after 1920, that it was necessary to seize the banks, collectivise them, and seize their assets. So anyway, that's a starting point on right-wing and left-wing economism, and maybe we can have some discussion now. I don't know if there's anyone who's got any questions online. If you want to indicate by raising a hand or putting something in the chat, you're very welcome to. And you can either speak yourself, or if you want, Marianne or myself can read out your comment or question, or anyone here wants to chip in. Speak up a little bit, because we've got a
interesting in the way in which very many people were on the list are fascism in Italy, as syndicalist route.
I'm going to paraphrase your question, because Mary can't hear you, okay?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So there's a microphone at the front here. So when people speak in the room, they need to speak up. So there was a questioner well, I don't know if it was a question, it was a comment in the hall, Mary, talking about the way in which within syndicalism, some syndicalists went to the far right. So I think, for example, Mussolini was, I don't know, he may have been in the Italian Socialist Party. Well, Alceste Ambris, but there were a number of syndicalists who moved towards the far right in the 1920s and 30s. So there's just a comment on that, I think. Okay. If anyone wants to come back on that, they can. Anyone else want to come in? Do raise your hand if you have a question online or in the room. Or a comment, sorry, I shouldn't. Silence. Yes.
Do you then that syndicalism was overall, in terms of, in terms of as a movement?
Yeah.
Non-productive branch.
Did you hear that, Mary?
No, sorry, couldn't hear that.
The question was, what was your assessment, or not necessarily you, but what is one's assessment of syndicalism? Was it a productive movement, or was it a, what was the phrase you used?
I guess sort of wasted energy, maybe a branch of the
wasted energy, a branch that didn't go anywhere. What was your assessment as a historian of the impact of syndicalism during this period that you've just discussed or described?
Do you want
to have a crack? Yeah, come on, have a crack at that. Everyone else is fanning themselves and waiting for you to speak.
I think it had a very important impact in the sense that that massive trade union growth in membership was really a product of that kind of new way of working, and also the figures that I put up about the number of strikes that that occurred in the period 1910 to 14 was very much inspired by this left-wing form of syndicalism, which, although it had all the negative aspects that Alex described, did have an amazingly positive impact in raising the level of class consciousness, not necessarily, and which actually then really had an important impact in the growth and development of the shop stewards movement. Not that that was necessarily syndicalist, but the level of activity and the fact that workers in struggle could, even if they had been battered down and defeated, they came up again and came up again. It raised, in general, I would say the most general point is to raise the level of class consciousness. But the point that was made before about syndicalism of the right, that syndicalists could move to the right, is certainly the case. I mean, for example, Bevan and Walter Citrine, who was later the General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress, were both very, would have considered themselves to be syndicalists. They were in favour of industrial unionism, one big union. After 1926, both of those men, although certainly not fascist, were very much veered to the right, were viciously anti-communist, and I would say racist and anti-Semitic as well. And so it's not one clear path. The class content of syndicalism, the left content of syndicalism, did lead to really, I think, led up to the mounting struggles which led to the general strike. So it did have some positive impact, but it changed. It changed politically as people like Tom Mann and others changed.
I would add that I think syndicalism's impact was immensely important. It reshaped organised labour around the world in a completely different way, even beyond what had happened with new unionism in that period in the 1890s in Britain, when the previously unorganisable, semi-skilled and unskilled workers were brought into trade unions. It transformed trade unions into fighting organisations with a clear class-conscious set of aims, and it gave them a sense of internationalism as well. You know, when you read about Tom Mann, you know, Mann learnt his syndicalism when he left this country in the late 1890s and went to Australia and South Africa. He travelled extensively in South Africa and in Australia, where he became a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies, the IWW, and he was involved in the Broken Hill mining strike, which is an incredibly important, very, very bitter strike in Australia. And when he came back, he was a convinced syndicalist, having gone through that experience. He lands back in Tilbury Dock in 1910 on a ship from Australia. He's met off the ship at Tilbury by Guy Aldred, an anarchist publisher, who went to meet him. And Aldred records that Mann's alleged words when he came off the boat at Tilbury was, and he asked him what he was going to do next. He said, "Let us go and meet the men of direct action." And he went off to Paris to meet with the CGT. So these were people who were completely brought into a new existence as part of an international working class movement by syndicalism. Not just Mann. We haven't mentioned James Connolly. You know, James Connolly, the most important Marxist from these, you know, born in these islands. James Connolly was a convinced industrial unionist, which he learnt through his syndicalism. Of course, the irony with Connolly is when other syndicalists turned their back on the state, Connolly, as an Irish Republican, understood that it was necessary to confront the British state and to overthrow the British state and to kick it out of Ireland. So he was a syndicalist who, if you like, moved away from the anti-statist form of syndicalism of a lot of his peers and became an Irish Republican, and was murdered by the British in 1916 after the post office, after the uprising. But equally, I think that Mary's talking about some of the rightward trajectory of some of the syndicalists, some of them even in this country, not just Citrine or Bevin, who were, I don't know about Citrine, that's a new one on me. I didn't realise he was associated with syndicalism, but certainly Havelock Wilson, who was the General Secretary of the National Seamen's and Firemen's Union in the period up to the First World War, was a radical syndicalist, a leading militant who appeared on platforms all over the country calling for, to smash the boss class and take over the ships, kick out the ship owners, and increase wages. As soon as war broke out in 1914, Havelock Wilson went over to the Ministry of War and offered his services to the Ministry of War to intern his own members, who were German nationals, German seafarers who were employed by British shipping companies and lived in London. And he had their names on lists because they were members of his union. And he went to the Ministry of War and offered to have them interned in a prison camp, which he and his union would run. And the Ministry of War gave him money to buy a manor house in Hampshire, where he proceeded to do just that. So there were, and I mean, he was an extreme xenophobe by the end of the First World War. So it was a contradictory movement, but certainly it was very, very important. It wasn't a waste of energy, no.
What did you say his name was?
James Havelock Wilson. Quite a character.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting.
Okay, so there's a question from in the chat from Shiva, which is: was there any attempt to co-opt or sway this trade unionism by the Liberals, Tories, and were they successful in any way? And if so, how? Mary?
Well, they were very successful. There was not only an attempt, but the British ruling class is very clever. If they hadn't attempted to co-opt and influence this new section of workers, and by 1885, the majority of male workers had the vote, we would have had socialism by now. We wouldn't have a Tory or a Labour government. So basically, what happened was that the Conservatives established working men's conservative associations in almost every industrial town, and in the agricultural areas they established the Primrose League, and the Liberals, as I've mentioned, they co-opted a working class, or at least allowed workers to stand under the Liberal banner, liberalism. And in the main, it was the Tories were extremely worried by this, because they thought that that would mean that there would always be the working class vote for the Liberal Party. So in a sense, each party competed to adopt a set of moderate reforms which would win over those section of workers. But the thing is, we can never. This is a question that we can ask ourselves today. Why do workers vote Conservative? How do we explain the Red Wall? And here, I think we have to understand the role of the the role of the ideological apparatus of the state, which of course is much more pervasive now than even it was then. But it's no accident that really by by the 1880s, elementary education, primary education, had become free and compulsory. And it's at this time that what we see is the emergence of the popular press, the emergence of various ways in which the minds of workers could be penetrated, in a sense. So this is going to be the subject really for next week.
Yes, getting ahead of ourselves.
The key way in which imperialism itself divided workers, or at least helped to incorporate a section of the working class, if not all of them, but through well, actually through racism in some respects. So the answer to your question is that yes, both parties were extremely successful, very successful in incorporating and providing a mechanism whereby votes of workers could be assured for either one or other of them. The fact that the Liberal Party imploded is another matter, and that's not something to go into now.
There's somebody here with a question at the back. Two people, in fact. I'll take you first.
Thanks. I think that one of the speakers obviously touched on how syndicalism ended up in. This gentleman talked about how, to what extent is it useful, and I'd like to ask a similar kind of question, but in terms of the struggles of, and then obviously beyond communist parties, to maintain ideological unity in the face of kind of constant splits and so on. I don't know if this bleeds a little bit too much into what's going to be discussed next week, but contrast that, say, with, so we talked about the Communist Party of France, obviously Communist parties in Britain, which had a lot of syndicalists that took, versus a Communist Party that came out of a national side of Europe. I think a contrast of ones that had a syndicalist versus ones that were.
Really interesting question. Lenin, of course, said that the problem with the British Communist Party was it was too proletarian. I think by which he meant it was too dominated by syndicalists. But there's a book here called Syndicalism and the Transition to Communism, published by Manchester, I think, University Press. No, it's Ashgate. No, by Ralph Darlington, who teaches at Salford University, which covers a lot of those questions. But Mary may want to respond.
I'm afraid I didn't hear the question. It was the question was,
what was the influence of syndicalism on the early on the formation of the communist parties in Europe, in Britain, and was it different from the those communist parties that were formed out of national liberation struggles? Did the syndicalist difference make a marked difference to the formation of communist parties in developed economies like Britain, France, presumably Germany to some extent, although it's slightly different anyway, compared to communist parties which came out of national liberation struggles?
Oh, it's a very good question. I think there's three parts. One is the peculiarities of Britain, in which it was the trade unions that formed the political organisation, whereas in all countries of European countries, it was the political organisation that, in a sense, was the grounding of the trade unions. In terms of the national liberation struggles, I think this is a really, really important question, and it's one that Lenin, I think, dealt with, because what we're talking about in most of the colonized countries is not the development of working class, it's more what happened to the peasantry. And Lenin, classical Marxists always said, well, you know, the only people who can lead the struggle will be the workers going to production, and somehow or other that all countries which were dominated by peasantry that's not where the revolution would take place, or where communism would have its most fertile ground. And of course, the Russian Revolution absolutely showed the opposite of that, because 80% of the Russian population were peasants. And Lenin had divided or showed that the peasantry couldn't be seen as a single homogeneous group, that that there were middling peasants, rich peasants. There were three categories anyway. Now this gave the tremendous impetus to the anti-colonial struggle, which of course was a combination of definitely of the peasantry and the sort of intellectual strata, as it was in Russia. And so communist parties were formed in those countries in very different way, in very different circumstances, through usually achieving well, they didn't achieve colonial liberation, but in the period that we're talking about, it was all much later, but colonial or national liberation movements had been formed in all of them. And that's where the importance of the Third International was, because the essence of seeing imperialism as a worldwide movement, and therefore the national liberation struggle against imperialism being absolutely vitally important to the development of socialism. That's what led Lenin to have these big arguments with the so-called economists, as he called them, who didn't see that the anti-imperial struggle was so important. When after the Russian Revolution, and when the Third International was established, there were tremendous debates about, and these nascent communist parties in the so-called Third World, as it was called then, or what we now call the Global South, were very, very important. So I think there are three elements to this, and I think that the way that communist parties were formed varied between Britain, probably America, the Third World, Russia, and just, I don't know about America. I don't know much about America really. So that's.
I'm going to take one more questioner who's at the back there. Oh, all right, two more.
Say would be the main, say, lessons and or warnings that we can take today.
I'm going to repeat the question so that Mary hears it. What do you think are the main lessons or warnings that we can take today from the period that you and we described and discussed earlier, Mary?
Over to you, Alan.
And I'll take two questions. So hold that one in your head and prepare your answer. And then
I was kind of going to ask pretty much the same.
handy.
Specifically looking at that within the current particular instance, the Liberal Party was not representing the Labour movement, and that closely echoes the increase in trade union membership experiencing right now, and of course, solidarity. And I was going to say, well, taking those three factors into consideration, what can we learn from history to progress forward?
So I'll repeat that again, just so that Mary gets it, if that's all right. And I'm not going to take any more. And that was a similar question. What can we learn today, given the certain seeming similarities between the situation that you've described and some of the context we're living in now? So in the period you've described, there's this disjunction between Lib-Labism, the political representation of the early political representation of Labour, and the trade unions, the working class. And today there seems to be a complete disjunction between the trade union movement, or a nearly complete disjunction between the trade union movement and its political representatives in the form of the Labour Party. Secondly, the need, or the perceived need by trade unionists to join up and coordinate their struggles. Today, there are some echoes of the period that you're describing in the Great Unrest, of things like, which led to the Triple Alliance between the miners, the transport workers and the railwaymen. And I can't remember what the third bit was, but... And we're witnessing a sort of, well, Syndicalism was a period of rising trade union membership. It's possible that that's what we're seeing now. I'm not convinced that that's actually become a fact, but there are a lot of people who are saying it should happen and we need to make it happen. But certainly the thing that I was going to say earlier, and I haven't said, is that if there's one lesson we learn from the Great Unrest before the First World War, it's the fact that they doubled trade union membership. And we need to get through to a whole generation, a lost generation of workers who've been essentially lost to trade unions. And we need to get them into trade unions and make trade unions relevant for them in this period. That's very much, I think, the priority after getting a pay rise. Mary, did you want to comment?
More, especially about lessons today. I think that you should. I don't mind coming in later, but please, you go ahead.
I mean, I would say about the lessons for today are pretty much the most important issue, I think, is to open trade unions up to workers again. What we've seen in the last couple of decades, particularly, has been not just a reduction in trade union membership since 1979 from 13 million to 6.5 million. We've also seen a reduction in collective bargaining coverage. So many workers in the private sector, particularly, mainly, are working outside of any trade union representation or bargaining arrangements. And so trade unionism, after 2 or 3 generations of this type of relationship, becomes something that's very remote from them. And I've personally experienced, speaking to members of my family, young people, 18-year-olds and their friends, who don't know what a trade union is, right? Which is an absolutely shocking thing. And these are young people who are working in care homes. The young woman I was speaking to was working in a care home, being exploited, very bright woman, very sparky, lots going for her. She knew she was being exploited. She knew she was being abused. And I said, well, ask a silly question, but are you a member of a trade union? And she said, what's a trade union? So this is the reality. And it's not just in the southeast of England you'll find that in Scotland, Wales, right across the country. There's a whole generation of young people and some older people who've got no relationship or knowledge of trade unions or trade unionism. So this moment, when we've got the railway workers, potentially the postal workers, the civil service union will be balloting its members for strike action in September. The teachers are coming in to ballot their members in October. This is a moment when we have the potential to put together hundreds of thousands of workers into a struggle which will generate consciousness of trade unionism in a layer of people who you just can't get through to. And the trade unions have to find a way to then get them into membership and have a relationship with them, which isn't just about them paying for a service. Because the structure of the economy, the labour market in this country is such that it's designed to repel workers from organised labour. It's designed to turn workers into disposable commodities who are simply recycled from one shitty job to another shitty job with very little training, and then they're just moved on after 6 months as soon as possible. That's the structure of the employment market that we have. So for trade unions to make themselves relevant enough to hold on to those members, those new members, is going to take some creative thinking. I mean, there is a lot of, I think, new thinking going on now. Certainly, my union, the RMT, is actively discussing linking up cleaning workers' disputes in the transport industry with cleaning workers' disputes in other sectors like the education sector or the health sector, where workers are represented by other trade unions and trying to coordinate those disputes. Because cleaning, one thing we've learned about the pandemic, cleaning is an absolutely essential service. Cleaners are essential workers. So how do we mobilise those essential workers to make their power count? Well, we have to do it through mobilising them together. So we have to start thinking in new ways about organising, and the old sort of silo arrangements that unions had, where we'll organise these over here, you keep your hands off them, you can organise those over there, don't get in our way, we won't get in yours, which is not what's needed anymore. But anyway, that's what I think. We're going to have to wind this up fairly shortly.
There was a question here.
I think they were essentially the same question, yeah. Did you want to add anything to that, Mary? I'm going to advertise the next week's lecture.
You've done us proud. No.
Okay, well, I'm just going to say, first of all, sorry about my croaky voice. I am testing negative for COVID, and I'm testing every day, so I think it's just a summer cold. Mary will be here with me next week, next Tuesday. We've got number 2 in this 3-series lecture. So next week, we're talking about trade unions and imperialism, looking at the labour aristocracy, which Mary mentioned briefly earlier, the influence of imperialist ideologies in the labour movement, such as eugenics and racism, which were products of that period of imperialism and were taught to the working class as ideological beliefs to buy into. We'll be talking about reformism versus socialism, what's different between reformism and socialism. Talk about why there is no mass Marxist party in Britain in comparison with other countries. Portugal was mentioned earlier. There is a mass Marxist party in Portugal. And we'll be talking finally about the Labourist compromise, that is to say the British Labour Party, its origins and development, where it comes from, what its peculiarities are. And Mary is one of the best people you could have to speak about these issues because she's written on it extensively. I'm going to just also make a plug to anyone who isn't a member of the Marx Memorial Library. We are brilliant. It's 25 quid a year if you're waged, and it's less. I can't remember if it's 15. I think 15 if you're unwaged a year. You get membership at this brilliant place. You get access to our journal, which contains lots of interesting essays, based on lectures such as the one that Mary, and with a little bit of help from me, has tried to deliver tonight. We have a totally unique archive. You're a member of it if you join. You can come in and read here, use our archives. We have over 60,000 books, newsletters, newspapers, pamphlets, which you won't find even in the British Library. And you can join us now by filling in a form, or if you're online, you can join us by going to our website and clicking join at the top of the page. And you can also book your spot at the next lecture by going to our website, and it's up there. Yeah, I don't have to read it out. Okay, so we'll do. Cough, cough. Yes, stay well. I hope to see you all next week. I should be worried if you know, people drop out, because I think I'll have given you something, but I hope I haven't. Anyway, thanks very much indeed, and
Thank you from me too.
to Mary as well.
No,
Cheers.
thank you.